Welcome back to the deep dive. Ready for another adventure into the world of feared books?
Absolutely. Always exciting to, dust off these old volumes and see what secrets we can uncover.
Today, we're cracking open a collection that's been whispered about for centuries. It sits right at the crossroads of ancient Egypt and Greek thought. We're talking about Thrice Greatest Hermes, Volume 2, The Sacred Sermons of the Trismegistic Wisdom.
This isn't just like some dusty old textbook. We're dealing with a compilation of sacred sermons attributed to, you guessed it, the legendary Hermes Trismegistus.
Episode 127, and we're diving deep, deep into this second volume. And
Yeah.
yeah, when you hear a name like Hermes Trismegistus, you know you're in for something special. It's not exactly light reading, is it?
No, not really. It's more like a distillation of ancient wisdom, trying to grapple with, the really big questions. What's God? How does the cosmos work? And where do we fit into all of this?
And you, our loyal listeners, your questions brought us here. You wanted to go beyond the surface to really understand why these ideas have captivated and sometimes even terrified people for so long.
Right, and that's exactly what we're here to do. We're going to break down some of these key sermons, pull out the most interesting bits, and try to get a sense of their lasting power.
So shall we? Let's dive in.
Okay, the first stop on our journey, the sermon to Asclepius.
Now, this sermon starts with a pretty simple question, like a physics 101 kind of thing. It asks, does everything that moves move within something else? And is it moved by something else as well?
Yeah, pretty straightforward. You move across a room. The room is the container, right? But it gets more complex, doesn't it?
It does, because then it starts talking about how whatever contains the movement, well, it has to be bigger or greater than what's being moved. It's a kind of a hierarchy. Like the thing that allows movement has to be more fundamental, more important.
Makes sense, I guess. So how does that relate to their concept of the void? Ah, the void. Now, this is where things get interesting. The Hermetic idea of void, it's not just emptiness, like a vacuum. It's something different. They call it the realm of is not. It's separate from, like, true existence. So basically, what we might think of as nothing is actually, well, a different kind of reality.
So not empty space, but more like potential. The possibility of things, but not things themselves.
Interesting. And then they go from the void to the bodiless. What's that all about?
Right. So the bodiless, they define it as pure mind and reason, what they call logos, And it's like complete self-sufficient. No need for a physical form, no chance of error. It's the archetype, the pure blueprint of the soul.
So, like, the ideal version of ourselves before we get bogged down with, bodies and stuff. Okay, so where does God fit into all of this?
Well, they're very clear about this. God isn't one of these things like mind or reason. He's the source of them. The origin of all that is, basically. So it's not enough to say God is mind. God is beyond all that, the wellspring of all qualities. Okay, now this part I find fascinating. The sermon says God is good alone. That's a pretty bold statement. Is there any wiggle room there?
Not really. The text is very insistent that only God is truly good. It even suggests that calling anything else good might be almost disrespectful, like we're diminishing the absolute perfection of God's goodness.
Really makes you think about how we use the word good so casually.
Right, exactly. And along with goodness, the text emphasizes another key name for God, Father.
Good and Father. Interesting combination. What's the significance of that pairing, would you say?
Well, it seems to highlight two fundamental aspects of the divine. The good points to the benevolent nature of God, while Father emphasizes the creative principle.
Okay, so moving from the nature of God to the act of creation, let's talk about the sacred sermon of Hermes, also known as Pomandres. This is where we get into like the Hermetic creation myth.
Yeah, this one's pretty epic. It starts with this incredible visionary experience. The narrator is lifted up, his senses are kind of held back, and he encounters this being called man-shepherd, described as the mind of all masterhood.
Sounds intense. What triggers this whole mystical experience?
A deep desire to understand, the nature of reality and to truly know God. And this desire, it's immediately acknowledged and embraced by this divine figure.
Okay, so before we get to the creation itself, what's the Hermetic picture of like the very beginning? What was there before anything else?
So before the familiar cosmos, there was darkness and this primordial moist nature. And all this existed before the emergence of light.
Darkness and moisture. Not the usual let there be light kind of story.
Yeah, very different. And then this light It's identified as God, as pure mind, and the light word, or logos, is revealed as the Son of God. So logos here is not just reason, but the divine creative principle.
Light is intelligence. Light is creation. Okay, I'm getting that. And this mind, the Father God, and the Word, the Logos, are they separate or?
They're deeply connected. The text says their union is what creates life itself, the vital force that runs through everything. And after this, the visionary sees the archetypal form within the mind, this perfect pattern that exists before time and without end.
So like the blueprint for everything that will come into being. Very Platonic. So how do the elements of nature, the stuff we can actually see and touch, how do they come into the picture?
They're born out of God's will. Nature, guided by the Word, by the Logos, sees this perfect cosmic order in the mind and copies it. It uses its own elements, its own births of souls, to create the cosmos we perceive.
So it's not just matter being passively shaped. Nature is actively involved in creation. That's an interesting idea. And then we move to the creation of more specific beings, right? Starting with God the Mind.
Right. So God the Mind is described as a being that includes both male and female principles. He's pure light and life. And from this mind comes another mind, characterized by fire and spirit. And the second mind, well, he creates the 7 rulers.
7 rulers. I'm guessing those are connected to, like, the planets, the celestial spheres.
Exactly. They govern the cosmos, basically. And they're often linked to the idea of fate. So it ties into ancient astrology, the belief that planetary movements influence our lives.
Interesting. So it's a layered process of creation, with each level giving rise to the next. And where do humans fit into all of this? The text mentions the descent of man. What does that mean exactly?
So initially, man is described as a deathless being with a kind of dominion over things, but then he chooses to descend into nature and experience, the limitations of mortal existence.
Why would he do that? Seems like a bad trade-off.
The reasons aren't fully explained, but it's clear that this descent leads to man becoming bound by fate, governed by the 7 rulers, even though he has this higher, deathless origin. And it's worth noting, he's described as being both male and female in this initial state.
So essentially, we're divine beings who've forgotten our true nature and are now stuck in this limited physical existence. That's a pretty potent idea. And this descent, this embrace of nature, it leads to even more creation. Right.
It does. Man's interaction with nature creates a wonder, 7 beings called men, but they correspond to the 7 rulers, and they're also androgynous, possessing both male and female aspects, and they move in the air. Eventually, though, this close connection breaks down, and they separate into the male and female beings we recognize today.
So it's like a kind of fragmentation of the original human form. And then what happens next in this cosmic drama?
Well, then God speaks through the holy word, the Logos. And he says, increase ye in increasing and multiply in multitude, the classic command to procreate. But then there's this interesting addition. And man that hath mind in him, let him learn to know that he himself is deathless, and that the cause of death is love, though love is all.
Whoa, the cause of death is love.
Yeah.
That's a tough one.
It definitely makes you think. The text doesn't really explain it further, but it seems to suggest a complex relationship between love, attachment, and mortality.
So how does that tie into the concept of, like, returning to our true divine nature?
Well, the sermon goes on to describe the physical body as being composed of elements and defines death as the draining away of water, one of the fundamental principles. And then it emphasizes the Father of the universals, consisting of light and life as our true origin, the source from which we all come.
So we're essentially light and life, temporarily embodied. And knowing this, recognizing this, that's the key.
Exactly. Pimandra says that if you understand yourself as being made of life and light and recognize that your current state is, well, a deviation from that, then you can return to that state of life. This knowledge, this gnosis, is presented as the way back to our divine nature.
Not just knowing about God, but a direct experience and knowing, okay, got it. And how does this return actually happen? Is there a specific process described?
It is. The text describes the earthly body dissolving back into its elements, the energies of the harmony being stripped away, and the soul ascending through the cosmic spheres. Eventually, it reaches the 8th sphere, beyond the planetary realms, and joins with those who eternally praise the Father. And the final stage is a complete surrender to the divine powers, becoming a power yourself and merging with God. The ultimate good, the ultimate goal for those who achieve gnosis.
So a journey of spiritual deconstruction and reunification.
Right.
Pretty intense. And the narrator, having had this vision, he now has a specific mission, right?
Yes, he's supposed to preach the beauty of devotion and gnosis to those who are well, still asleep, lost in the material world, caught up in its fleeting sensations. It's a call to wake up, become sober, and turn towards the light.
Powerful stuff. Okay, moving on to the next sermon. The Cup or Monad of Hermes to Tat. That title, with the cup and the monad, it really emphasizes the idea of unity, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. The cup and the monad, they both point to the same thing, the oneness, the single fundamental element from which everything comes. And what's important here is the relationship between this oneness and gnosis.
Right, Gnosis, that inner knowing. So is Gnosis the source of this oneness?
Actually, no, the sermon is clear about that. Gnosis is the way we come to understand the oneness. It's the starting point for gaining a true knowledge of God, which is, in a way, the same as knowing the oneness. And this gnosis, it leads to becoming a perfect man.
But it doesn't stop there, right? There's something even beyond that.
Yes, the ultimate state is described as becoming one with God, total harmonious unity. And the path to this, it's not some new invention. The text talks about the ancient path of gnosis.
The ancient path. So it's about rediscovering something that's always been there, not creating something new, but remembering something very old.
Precisely. Now, let's move on to a sermon with a very intriguing title. Though unmanifest God is most manifest, of Hermes to his son Tat. That's a bit of a head-scratcher, isn't it? How can something be unmanifest and manifest at the same time?
Yeah, sounds like a paradox, like one of those Zen koans.
Right. And the sermon starts by asking some basic questions about the cosmos, like who set the courses of the stars, who defined the boundaries of the sea, questions about the order of things.
Okay, and I'm guessing those questions lead to the idea of a creator.
They do. The sermon argues that there must be a maker, a lord of all things, someone who established the order, the places, the measurements of the universe.
So a cosmic architect. And this maker, this God, he's beyond our usual categories, right?
Completely. He's described as being greater than all names. He's the father of all names, in fact. His very being is the act of creation, of bringing things into existence.
Always creating, always bringing things forth. And that ties into the idea of God being both manifest and unmanifest.
Exactly. God is the things that are the things we can see and experience, but he's also the things that are not, the potential, the unformed. So he's both hidden and revealed at the same time.
It's like we can see his works, but not his essence.
Right. And the editor's note even points out how difficult it is to translate these ideas, especially the wordplay around manifest in the original Greek. It shows how language itself can limit our understanding.
Right. Sometimes the deeper meaning gets lost in translation. Okay, next up we have, in God alone is good and elsewhere, nowhere. This seems to really emphasize that idea we talked about earlier, that God is the only source of true goodness.
It does. The sermon really hammers home that point. It says that good isn't just an attribute of God, it's his essence. And it connects the beautiful with God as well, saying that true beauty is inherently good because it comes from God.
So beauty and goodness are part of God's very nature.
Exactly. And that means we can't find true, lasting good anywhere else. Not in material things, not in worldly experiences. Those are just reflections, images of the real thing.
Don't put your faith in possessions or fleeting pleasures, basically.
Right. The sermon suggests that even thinking about God leads to a deeper understanding of beauty and goodness, going beyond our usual ideas of, physical light. And it makes a clear distinction. These qualities, they can't be separated from God, and they can't be truly joined to anything else.
So if we're seeking true goodness and beauty, we have to turn towards God.
That's the message. Now let's look at a sermon that talks about a major obstacle to this connection with God. The greatest ill among men is ignorance of God.
Ignorance. Pretty big problem, I guess, especially when it comes to spiritual matters.
This sermon is very direct about that. It says, ignorance of God is the root of all badness, all corruption. It leads to a kind of living death, even though you're physically alive.
Wow, strong words. And this ignorance, it blocks us from seeing the truth.
Yes. It's described as a cloak that prevents us from seeing the beauty of truth and goodness. And it also hides its own deceptive nature. So we don't even realize how ignorant we are. It blocks our spiritual senses, basically.
So we're blind to what's really important. And how do we get rid of this cloak of ignorance?
The sermon says we have to wake up, stop being drunk on physical sensations, and open our eyes to the light. And the way to do that is through Gnosis. That's the true gospel, according to this text. Same message we saw in Pomandres.
Gnosis is the key.
Okay.
And this path of Gnosis, It has a specific destination.
Yes, it leads to the harbor of salvation, a great community devoted to holy living, which then leads to the gates of Gnosis.
So it's not just about individual enlightenment, but joining with others who share this path.
That seems to be part of it. And the way to get there is to detach ourselves from this cloak of ignorance, and that's done through the mind and heart, not just through our physical senses.
So it's an inner journey, transformation of consciousness. Okay, let's move on to a sermon that offers a different perspective. That no one of existing things doth perish. Sounds like a comforting message, especially in a world where everything seems so impermanent.
It is. This sermon challenges the idea of absolute annihilation. It says that the Father created the cosmos, this universal sphere, and then wrapped it around the essence of life, making matter itself eternal.
So nothing truly dies, it just changes form.
That's the idea. And within this sphere, God sows lives, which are like the seeds of all beings and all order. And the sermon makes distinctions between God, cosmos, mortal life, and undying life.
Okay, so how are all these things connected? The text says cosmos is by God and in God, but man by cosmos and in cosmos.
Right. God is the source, the limit, and the constitution of everything. He's the ultimate ground of being. And there are three great lives, according to this sermon: God, cosmos, and man.
3 levels of existence.
Yes. Cosmos is made in the image of God, and man is made in the image of cosmos. Man has both sense and mind. Sense connects him to the physical cosmos, the world we can perceive, but mind connects him to the intelligible cosmos, the realm of the good mind, where God resides.
So we have this dual nature connected to both the material and the spiritual.
Exactly. And death in this context isn't seen as a true ending. It's described as a privation of sense, a temporary loss of consciousness, not annihilation, but a transition.
Interesting, like the soul just goes dormant for a while. This idea of a temporary withdrawal, it seems to lead into the next sermon on thought and sense, which focuses on people who achieve Gnosis.
Right. This sermon looks at the difference between sense, which is tied to matter, and thought, which is connected to a more fundamental substance. And it points out that Gnostics, people who've attained Gnosis, they don't really fit in with the rest of the world.
They're the oddballs, the outsiders.
Yeah, pretty much. The text says they please not the many, nor the many them. They're often misunderstood, hated, even killed. It shows how radical this idea of Gnosis really is.
Yeah, knowing the truth can be dangerous, especially when it challenges the status quo.
Definitely. But the sermon also says that those devoted to God, once they've experienced Gnosis, they see good in everything. And they have this ability to transform bad things into good things.
That's a powerful idea. Not just enduring bad stuff, but actually changing it.
Right. And the sermon also talks about where badness comes from. It says it's inherent to the earth, not to the cosmos as a whole. So it's a product of our limited perspective, our attachment to the material world.
Okay, so evil is a kind of localized phenomenon. And the way to transcend it is through Gnosis, through understanding. Got it. Now let's move on to what sounds like a key text, the key of Thrice Greatest Hermes. I'm assuming this was considered a pretty important sermon.
Oh, absolutely. This one was seen as a condensed version of the general sermons, specifically addressed to Tat. And it starts by saying that God, referred to as Father and the Good, shares the same essence or energy with everything he creates.
So there's this fundamental connection between God and creation.
Yes. And it emphasizes God's continuous will to create. Unlike a human maker who might stop working, God's creative activity never ceases. And the defining characteristic of the good is that it wants to be known.
Interesting. It's not just good in itself. It wants to be recognized, understood.
Right. And the sermon goes on to talk about the soul. The divine soul uses spirit as its vehicle, pervading the living being. And when it's freed from the body, the mind puts on a robe of fire.
So it sheds the physical and takes on a more refined spiritual form. And what happens to the soul after death? Does it depend on how you lived your life?
It does. Pious souls, those who knew God and did good, they become pure mind, they become daimonic and divine. But impious souls, they remain attached to their old nature. They seek out another earthly body to inhabit.
Reincarnation, basically. But only into human forms.
That's what the text says. God's law prevents human souls from going into animals. And the cries of the punished souls, it's not that they're literally turning into beasts, but they're suffering in some other way.
Okay, so no literal transformation, but still a form of punishment. And the mind, when it becomes a daemon, it has a specific role to play.
Yes. It takes on a fiery body and serves God by punishing the impious souls. It's a kind of cosmic justice. And the sermon ends with this powerful image. Man on earth is a mortal God, while God in heaven is an immortal man.
A mirror image. Humanity reflecting divinity, and divinity connected to humanity. Okay, let's move on to Mind unto Hermes. This one seems to focus on the relationship between God, the eon, and the cosmos.
It does. It starts with this desire to understand the truth about everything, and it trusts the guidance of the master, who is identified as mind itself. And it reiterates that God is unseen, but most manifest through his creation. That act of creation is his goodness and his virtue.
So the world around us is the best way to understand God. And then there's this concept of eon. What exactly is that?
Eon is the principle that orders and governs the cosmos. It gives even matter a kind of immortality. And all creation, all becoming, depends on Eon, just like Eon depends on God.
Okay, so there's a hierarchy here. And what about change and permanence? Are some things eternal while others are constantly changing?
Yes, the heavenly realms are unchanging, while the earthly realms are subject to change. And Eon and time, they both have a double nature, a heavenly aspect and an earthly aspect.
So time itself isn't uniform. It operates differently in different realms.
Right. And there's a specific order. God's soul is mind, mind's soul is Eon, Ion's soul is cosmos, and cosmos' soul is earth. And God is in mind and soul, soul and matter, all through Aeon.
A chain of interconnectedness.
Exactly. And then the sermon emphasizes the unity of God. It says, if cosmos, sun, moon, and Godhead are one, then God is also one.
One being, many manifestations.
Right. And it uses the analogy of a single person performing many actions. Just like one person can do many things, God can create all things. And in this context, life, beauty, good, and God are all synonymous.
All pointing to the same ultimate reality.
Yes. And God works alone. His being is inseparable from his doing. And it clarifies that God's creation isn't driven by any kind of pleasure or lack.
Not like a human craftsman who enjoys the process of making.
Right. And it reiterates the interconnectedness of all things through this chain of emanation. Eon is God's image, cosmos is Eon's image, sun is cosmos's image, and man is sun's image.
Each level mirroring the one above it. And what about death? How does that fit into this scheme?
Death is seen as the separation of mind and soul, but not their destruction. We see change as death because the body dissolves and the life force withdraws. But even the cosmos undergoes change. Parts of it become unmanifest every day, but it's never completely destroyed.
So a constant cycle of transformation, but not annihilation.
Right, and everything exists in God, but not in a physical sense. Because God is bodiless, he's the most comprehensive, the fastest, the most potent of all things.
Beyond space and time.
Exactly, and
Yeah.
God created all things so that he could be seen through them. Just as we see ourselves in our thoughts, God sees himself in his creation.
That's a beautiful image. Okay, let's move on to about the common mind of Hermes Tatat. This one seems to be about the universal mind and how it manifests in the world.
It is. It starts by saying that even a mind-led person, someone on a spiritual path, can still experience suffering caused by things they haven't done. Because everything is interconnected and change is constant.
So you can't escape the effects of negativity, even if you're not directly involved.
Right. But the sermon also says that you can free yourself from these negative influences through the power of your own mind.
So there's always hope, always a way to transcend the challenges.
Yes. And then it mentions the blessed God, good daemon, who gives voice to divine words, or logoi. And it makes a distinction between speech, which is common to all humans, and voice, which is unique to each individual.
So speech represents the shared logos, the universal reason, while voice is our individual expression of it.
That's the idea. And human speech, even though there are many languages, it's fundamentally one. We can understand each other, which shows the power and greatness of the logos within us. And the sermon ends with this powerful statement: one is all.
The ultimate unity.
Exactly. And finally, we have the secret Sermon on the Mountain concerning rebirth. This one sounds like it's about the core of spiritual transformation.
Rebirth. That suggests a radical change, a new beginning.
It does. And in this sermon, Tat asks for clarification about rebirth, something that was hinted at in earlier sermons. And rebirth is described as a state you achieve when you become a stranger to the world, when you ascend the mountain.
The mountain here being a symbol of spiritual growth, I'm guessing.
Exactly. It's not a literal place, but a metaphor for inner transformation. And during this process, you stop seeing yourself in the usual way. The goal is to pass right through yourself, like in a waking dream.
To transcend the ego, the limited self. Okay, I'm getting that. And who or what is the author of this rebirth?
The sermon identifies it as the Son of God, the one man, acting according to God's will. And the experience is described as overwhelming, disorienting, but ultimately illuminating. You see the greatness of the divine, which is identical with your own true form.
So it's emerging with the divine or recognition of your own inherent divinity. And how do you actually go through this process? Is there a method, a practice?
There is. It involves withdrawing inward, consciously willing the transformation, letting go of your senses, and allowing divinity to be born within you. And it also involves purging yourself of what the text calls the brutish or material torments.
The things that keep us bound to the lower realms.
Right. And the sermon lists 12 key torments of the darkness: not knowing, grief, intemperance, concupiscence, unrighteousness, avarice, error, envy, guile, anger, rashness, and malice. And there are many others that stem from these.
I feel like a pretty comprehensive list of human failings.
It is. And rebirth happens when these torments start to leave you. Through God's grace, they gradually disappear. And it's complete, this birth in understanding, when the 10 virtues overcome the 12 torments. And at that point, you become a god.
You realize your divine potential.
Exactly. And the text emphasizes that the physical body is separate from this spiritual birth. The body dies, but the true self is eternal.
Death becomes irrelevant because you've already experienced true birth.
Right. And you realize that you've been born a god, a son of the One. And this experience is accompanied by a kind of praise-giving that's heard in the realm of the Ogdode, the 8th sphere of divine power. But this praise is usually kept secret, hidden in silence.
So it's not something you shout from the rooftops.
No. And the sermon even gives specific instructions for worship at sunset and sunrise, facing south and east. And it includes a secret hymnody, an invocation meant for all of creation, for earth, abyss, even the trees.
A truly universal hymn.
Yes. And it's addressed to God through the elements and his creatures. The goal is to find peace and rest in God, the object of your search. And this praise-giving, it's said to be visible only to the mind.
So it's an inner experience, not an outer spectacle.
Exactly. And the sermon emphasizes the importance of keeping silent about all this, to avoid being misunderstood, to protect the sanctity of the experience. The ultimate goal is to know yourself and to know the Father within your mind.
Self-knowledge and knowledge of God. The two are intertwined. Wow, that was quite a journey. We've covered so much ground in this deep dive into Thrice Greatest Hermes, Volume 2.
We have. We've explored the nature of God, the creation of the cosmos, the descent of man, the power of Gnosis, the meaning of death, and the process of spiritual rebirth. It's a truly remarkable collection of texts.
It really is. And it's fascinating to see how these ancient ideas, this blend of Egyptian and Greek thought, has influenced so many different traditions throughout history. It's clear why these writings have captivated and sometimes even frightened people for centuries.
They offer a radically different perspective on reality, one that challenges conventional wisdom and demands a lot from the individual.
It's not a comfortable path, but it offers profound rewards for those willing to take the journey.
Absolutely.
So, listener, as we wrap up this deep dive, we invite you to consider these ideas for yourself. What resonates with you? What challenges you? What cloak of ignorance might you be carrying? And are you ready to shed it? We encourage you to explore these Hermetic texts further and see what hidden truths you might uncover.
You might be surprised by what you find.
Until next time on the deep dive, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep exploring the hidden corners of knowledge.